Thank you, Raj, for those generous words and that very kind introduction. My very good friend and mentor, Biru Dayal, former Under Secretary General and Chef of the Cabinet, Monsieur Patrice Bizot, the UN Resident Coordinator and UNDP Res Rep, Ms. Caitlin Wiesen-Antin, Justice Banerjee, Professor Barnes, Professor Murthy, ladies and gentlemen. It's customary, of course, to begin these things by saying that it's a pleasure to be here, and I can assure you it is. But I do have good news and bad news. The good news is I'm not going to speak to you about sub-regional human rights mechanisms. You're here to do that. I suspect that you know far more about sub-regional human rights mechanisms than I ever will. And in any case, if I were to exhaust the topic this evening, you would not have very much to do for the rest of the workshop. So I shall leave that field to you. But the bad news is I've still been asked to address you for half an hour on human rights. So what I thought I would do to help perhaps offer a contribution to a platform for your discussions is to address the larger question of the universality of human rights. The growing consensus, particularly in the Western world, that human rights are universal, has, as you know, been opposed quite fiercely by critics in other parts of the world. At the very least, the idea may pose more questions than it answers. Beyond the more general philosophical question of whether anything in our pluricultural, multipolar world is truly universal, the issue of whether human rights is an essentially Western concept, ignoring the very different cultural, economic, and political realities of the other parts of the world, cannot simply be dismissed. It's just arisen again in India yesterday with the whole controversy over internet censorship, which I promise I will return to later in my remarks. And so amongst the questions this raises are, can the values of a consumer society be applied to societies that have nothing to consume? Isn't talking about universal rights rather like saying that the rich and the poor both have the same right to fly first class and to sleep under bridges? Don't human rights, as laid out in the international covenants, ignore the traditions, the religions, and the socio-cultural patterns of what used to be called the Third World? And at the risk of sounding frivolous, when you stop a man in traditional dress from beating his wife, are you upholding her human rights or violating his? Now, this is anything but an abstract debate. To the contrary, ours is an era in which wars have been waged in the name of human rights, and in which many of the major developments in international law have presupposed the universality of the concept. By the same token, the perception that human rights as a universal discourse is increasingly serving as a flag of convenience for other far more questionable political agendas accounts for the degree to which the very idea of human rights is being questioned and resisted by both intellectuals and states in some parts of the world. These objections need to be taken very seriously by those of you whom I, like myself, are wedded to the concept of human rights. Now, the philosophical objection to human rights asserts essentially that nothing can be universal, that all rights and values are defined and limited by cultural perceptions. If there is no universal culture, there can be no universal human rights. In fact, some philosophers have objected that the concept of human rights is founded on an anthropocentric, that is a human-centered view of the world, predicated upon an individualistic view of man as an autonomous being whose greatest need is to be free from interference by the state, free to enjoy what one Western writer summed up, quite seriously, as the right to private property, the right to freedom of contract, and the right to be left alone, quote unquote. But this view would seem to clash with the communitarian one propounded by other ideologies and cultures, where society is conceived of as far more than the sum of its individual members. Implicit in this is a series of broad culturally grounded objections. Historically, in a number of non-Western cultures, individuals are not accorded rights in the same way as they are in the West. Critics of the universal idea of human rights contend that in the Confucian or Vedic traditions, duties are considered more important than rights. While in Africa, it is the community that protects and nurtures the individual. One African writer summed up the African philosophy of existence as, and I quote, "I am because we are, and because we are, therefore I am," unquote. Some Africans have argued they have a complex structure of communal entitlements and obligations, grouped around what one might call 4 R's. Not rights, not one of the 4 R's, but respect, restraint, responsibility, and reciprocity. They argue that in most African societies, group rights have always taken precedence over individual rights, and that political decisions have been made through group consensus, not through the individual assertion of rights. Now, these cultural differences, to the extent that they are real and not merely theoretical, have practical implications. Many in developing countries have been arguing that some human rights are simply not relevant to their societies. The right, for instance, to political pluralism. Ask Mr. Mugabe about that. The right to paid vacations, always good for a laugh in the sweatshops of some of our developing world countries. And inevitably, the rights of women. It is not just that some societies claim that they are simply unable to provide certain rights to all their citizens, but rather that they see the universal conception of human rights as little more than an attempt to impose alien Western values on them. Rights promoting the equality of the sexes are a contentious case in point. How, critics demand, can women's rights be universal in the face of widespread divergences of cultural practice? When in many societies, for example, marriage is not seen as a contract between 2 individuals, but as an alliance between lineages, and when the permissible behavior of womenfolk is seen by them as central to the society's perception of its honor. I'm not answering the questions, I'm just raising the fact that they exist. And inseparable from the issues of tradition is the issue of religion. For religious critics of the universalist definition of human rights, nothing can be universal that is not founded on transcendental values, symbolized by God and sanctioned by the guardians of the faith or the various faiths. They point out that the cardinal document of the contemporary human rights movement, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, can claim no such heritage. In fact, the 65th anniversary of the Human Rights Declaration is upon us. Right? No, have I gone too far? 63rd, right? Correct me, somebody. 48 is when it was accepted, so 63rd. Celebrated, I'm sure it will be with much fanfare. But critics from countries that were still colonies in 1948 suggest that its provisions reflect the ethnocentric bias of that time. They go on to argue that the concept of human rights is really a cover for Western interventionism in the affairs of the developing world. They cite Iraq, they cite Libya, and they say that human rights are merely an instrument of Western political neocolonialism. One critic in the 1970s wrote of his fear that human rights, and I quote, might turn out to be a Trojan horse surreptitiously introduced into other civilizations, which will then be obliged to accept those ways of living, thinking, and feeling for which human rights is the proper solution in cases of conflict, unquote. Now, in practice, this argument tends to be as much about development as about civilizational integrity, which is why I'm so glad that UNDP is co-sponsoring this workshop. Critics argue that the developing countries often cannot afford human rights, since the tasks of nation building, economic development, and the consolidation of the state structure to these ends are still unfinished. Authoritarianism, they argue, in various diluted forms, is no longer fashionable to advocate authoritarianism, but in various degrees is more efficient in promoting development and economic growth. This is the premise behind the so-called Asian values case that was made so avidly in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, which attributes the economic growth of Southeast Asia to the Confucian values of obedience, order, and respect for authority. The argument is even a little more subtle than that, because the suspension or limiting of human rights is also portrayed as the sacrifice of the few for the benefit of the many. The human rights concept is understood, applied and argued over only, the critics say, by a small westernized minority in the developing countries. Universality in these circumstances would be the universality of the privileged. Human rights is for the few of us in developing countries who have the concerns of Westerners. It does not extend, they say, to the lowest rungs of the ladder. That is, in short, the case for the prosecution, the indictment of the assumption of the universality of human rights. There is, of course, a case for the defense, and that's the one I'm here to emphasize. The philosophical objection is, perhaps surprisingly, the easiest to counter. After all, concepts of justice and law, the legitimacy of government, the dignity of the individual, protection from oppressive or arbitrary rule, and participation in the affairs of the community are found in every society on the face of this earth. Far from being difficult to identify, the number of philosophical common denominators between different cultures and political traditions makes universalism anything but a distortion of reality. Historically, a number of developing countries, notably India, China, Chile, Cuba, Lebanon, and Panama, played an active and highly influential part in the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In the case of the Human Rights Covenants in the 1960s, the developing world actually made the decisive contribution. It was the new majority of developing countries, third world states as we were called, emerging from colonialism, particularly Ghana and Nigeria, that helped break the logjam, ending the East-West stalemate that had held up adoption of the covenants for nearly 2 decades. We tend to forget that sometimes. But the human rights covenants were held up right up to the mid-60s because of the conflict between the East and the West, and the developing world broke through this stalemate. The principles of human rights have been widely adopted, imitated, and ratified by developing countries. The fact that, therefore, they were devised by less than a third of the states now in existence is really irrelevant. In reality, many of the current objections to the universality of human rights reflect a false opposition between the primacy of the individual and the paramountcy of society. Many of the civil and political rights protect groups, while many of the social and economic rights protect individuals. Thus, crucially, the two sets of rights and the two covenants that codify them are like Siamese twins, inseparable and interdependent, sustaining and nourishing each other. Still, while the conflict between group rights and individual rights may not be inevitable, it would be naive to prefer that conflict would never occur. But while groups may collectively exercise rights, the individuals within them should also be permitted the exercise of their rights within the group, rights that the group may not infringe upon. Those who champion the view that human rights are not universal frequently insist that their adversaries have hidden agendas. In fairness, the same accusation can be leveled against at least some of those who cite culture as a defense against human rights. Authoritarian regimes who appeal to their own cultural traditions are cheerfully willing to crush culture domestically when it suits them to do so. Also, the traditional culture that is sometimes advanced to justify the non-observance of human rights, including in Africa, in practice no longer exists in a pure form at the national level anywhere in the world. The societies of developing countries have not remained in a pristine, non-Western, pre-Western state. All have been subject to change and distortion by external influence, both as a result of colonialism in many cases, but also, in more recent times, through participation in modern interstate relations. You cannot impose the model of a modern nation state, cutting across tribal boundaries and conventions on your country, appoint a president and an ambassador to the United Nations, and then argue that tribal tradition should be applied to judge the human rights conduct of the resulting modern state. There is a certain hypocrisy in their argument. But in any case, there should be nothing sacrosanct about culture. Culture is constantly evolving in any living society, responding to both internal and external stimuli. And there is much in every culture that societies quite naturally outgrow and reject. Am I, as an Indian, obliged to defend in the name of my culture the practice of sati, which was banned 160 years ago, of obliging widows to immolate themselves on their husbands' funeral pyres? Or the fact that slavery was acceptable across the world for at least 2,000 years does not make it acceptable to us now? The deep historical roots of anti-Semitism in European culture for almost 2,000 years cannot justify discrimination against Jews today. The problem with the culture argument is that it subsumes all members of a society under a cultural framework that may in fact be inimical to them. It is one thing to advocate the cultural argument with an escape clause. That is, that one does not seek to coerce the dissenters, but permits individuals to opt out and to assert their individual rights. Those who freely choose to live by and to be treated according to their traditional cultures are welcome to do so, provided others who wish to be free are not oppressed in the name of a culture they prefer to disavow. Actually, a controversial but pertinent example of an approach that seeks to strengthen both cultural integrity and individual freedom comes from our own country, from our highly resented and resisted Muslim Women Protection of Rights Upon Divorce Act of 1987. This piece of legislation was enacted following the famous Shah Banu case, in which the Supreme Court upheld the right of a divorced Muslim woman to alimony, prompting howls of outrage from Muslim traditionalists who claimed this violated their religious beliefs that divorced women were only entitled to the return of the bride price paid upon marriage. The Indian Parliament, as you may remember, then passed a law to override the court's judgment, under which Muslim women married under Muslim law would be obliged to accept the return of the bride price as the only payment of alimony, but that the official Muslim charity, the Waqf Board, was then supposed to assist them. Now, many Muslim women and feminists amongst them were outraged by this. But the interesting point is that if a Muslim woman does not want to be subject to the provisions of the Act, she can marry under the Civil Code. If she marries under Muslim personal law, she will be subject to its provisions. That may be the kind of balance that can be struck between the rights of Muslims as a group to protect their traditional practices and the right of a particular Muslim woman who may not choose to be subject to that particular law to exempt herself from it. I recognize there is room for contention here because you may be talking about a young girl who's not in a position to resist her family's wishes and is forced to marry under Muslim law and then pays a price for it later. These are the social complications that are worth discussing. But the principle remains that, let us say, a woman marrying of her own free will always have the choice as to how to marry. Now, it needs to be emphasized that the objections that are voiced to specific allegedly Western sounding rights very frequently involve the rights of women and are usually vociferously argued by men. Even conceding for argument's sake that child marriage, widow inheritance, female circumcision, and the like are not found reprehensible by many societies, how do the victims of these practices feel about them? How many teenage girls who've had their genitalia mutilated would have agreed to undergo circumcision if they had the human right to refuse to permit it? For me, the standard is simple. Where coercion exists, rights are violated. And these violations must be condemned, whatever the traditional justification. So it is not culture that is the test, in my view, it is coercion. Nor can religion be deployed to sanction the status quo. Every religion seeks to embody certain verities that are applicable to all mankind. Justice, truth, mercy, compassion, though the details of their interpretation vary according to the historical and geographical context in which the religion originated. As my former boss, UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, has often said, the problem is usually not with the faith, but with the faithful. In any case, freedom is not a value found only in Western faiths. It is highly prized in Buddhism, and as Amartya Sen has explained so well in his book, in different aspects of Hinduism and Islam as well. If religion cannot be fairly used to sanction oppression, it should be equally obvious that authoritarianism promotes repression, not development. Development is about change, but repression prevents change. If I can go back to Amartya Sen, he's pointed out in a number of interesting pieces that there is now a generally agreed upon list of policies that are helpful to economic development. And I'm sure UNDP won't dissent from this. Openness to competition, the use of international markets, a high level of literacy and school education, successful land reforms, and public provision of incentives for investment, export, and industrialization, none of which require authoritarianism. None is incompatible with human rights. Indeed, it's the availability of political and civil rights that gives people the opportunity to draw attention to their needs and to demand action from the government. Sen's work has established, for example, that no substantial famine has ever occurred in any independent and democratic country with a free press. That is striking, though there may be cases where authoritarian societies have had success in achieving economic growth. A country like Botswana, an exemplar of democracy in Africa, has grown far faster than most authoritarian states. In any case, when one hears of the unsuitability or inapplicability or ethnocentrism of human rights, it is important to ask what the unstated assumptions of this view really are. What exactly are these human rights that it's so unreasonable to promote? If one picks up the more contentious covenant, the one on civil and political rights, and looks through the list, what can one find that someone in a developing country can easily do without? Not the right to life, one trusts, freedom from torture, the right not to be enslaved, not to be physically assaulted, not to be arbitrarily arrested, imprisoned, executed. No one actually advocates in so many words the abridgment of any of these rights. In fact, as Kofi Annan asked bluntly at a speech in Tehran University in 1997, and I quote, "When have you heard a free voice demand an end to freedom? Where have you heard a slave argue for slavery? When have you heard a victim of torture endorse the ways of the torturer? Where have you heard the tolerant cry out for intolerance?" Unquote. I don't think it can be put any better than that. Tolerance and mercy have always and in all cultures been ideals of government rule and human behavior. If we do not unequivocally assert the universality of the rights that oppressive governments abuse, and if we admit that these rights can be diluted and changed, ultimately we risk giving oppressive governments an intellectual justification for the morally indefensible. Objections to the applicability of international human rights standards have all too frequently been voiced by authoritarian rulers and power elites to rationalize their violations of human rights, violations that serve primarily, if not solely, to sustain them in power. Just as the devil can famously quote scripture for his purpose, third world communitarianism can be the slogan of a deracinated tyrant trained, as in the case of Pol Pot at the Sorbonne. The authentic voices of the developing world know how to cry out in pain. It is time to heed them. Now, I said that I would have to acknowledge that sometimes in our part of the world, some modest exceptions may have to be contemplated. The controversy over the government of India's alleged desire to censor Facebook, Twitter, and other leading lights of the social media has obscured this question, this rather urgent and genuine question that we need to address about the human right to free speech in our society. For those of you who haven't read a newspaper today or yesterday, the problem arose when the New York Times reported on Monday that our telecoms minister, Kapil Sibal, had called in senior social media executives from Facebook, Microsoft, Google, and Yahoo, and allegedly asked them to, and I quote, pre-screen user content from India and to remove it before it goes online. Such a request inevitably sparked off a firestorm of internet protests against the minister without waiting to hear his side of the story. Facebook pages sprang up to denounce him, web boards overflowed with nasty and salty comments against the minister, the ruling party, and the government, suggesting they were trying to protect a political leader, and the hashtag idiot Kapil Sibal started trending on Twitter, all a bit over the top. Now, as a frequent recipient of disparaging, inflammatory, and defamatory content myself on social media and other media, I'm no great fan of unpleasantness in any media, social or otherwise, but I'm strongly opposed to censorship. Freedom of speech is not just to me a universal human right, but it's fundamental to any democracy. And many of the most valuable developments in India would not have been possible without it. Freedom of speech is the mortar that binds together the bricks of our democracy, and it's also the open window embedded in those bricks. Free speech keeps our government accountable and helps our political leaders to know what people are thinking. So censorship is a disservice to both rulers and ruled. But, and free speech advocates hate that but, every society recognizes some sensible restraints on how free speech is exercised. Those restraints almost always relate to the collectivity. They arise when the freedom of the individual to say what he wants causes more harm to more people in society than restricting his freedom would. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes in the US put it memorably when he said that freedom of speech does not extend to the right to shout fire in a crowded theater. After all, that could cause a stampede in which people could get trampled upon, injured, and even killed, and the theater's property destroyed, all consequences that would outweigh the individual's right to say what he likes. Now, since societies vary in their cultural and political traditions, the boundaries vary from place to place. Free speech absolutists tend to say that freedom is a universal human right that must not be abridged in the name of culture. And in principle, I don't agree. I don't disagree, I mean. But in practice, such abridgment often takes place. If not by law, then by convention. No American editor would allow the N-word to be used to describe black Americans, not because it's against the law, but because it would cause such offense as to be unacceptable to use. Just as the commonplace practice of women taking off their bikini tops at Saint-Tropez, Copacabana, or Bondi Beach could not be replicated on the beaches of Goa, Dubai, or Karachi without risking assault or arrest, so also things that might be said in the former set of places might not pass muster in the latter. It's no use pretending that such differences of culture, politics, and sensitivity don't exist. They do. And they're the reason why free speech in, say, Sweden isn't the same as free speech in Singapore. The problem is particularly acute on social media because it's a public forum for the expression of private thoughts. The fact is that social media's biggest asset is also its biggest problem. Its strength is that social media enables ordinary people, not just trained journalists, to share vivid, real-time, unfiltered images and text reports before any other source, including governments or traditional media, can do so. Even more, any individual with the basic literacy needed to operate a keyboard can express his or her opinion, create information, whether video or text, and communicate it immediately without the delays necessarily wrought by editorial controls, cross-checking, or even the synthesizing that occurs in a mainstream media newsroom. That gives social media an advantage over regular media as a disseminator of public opinion. If you wanted to express your views in, say, a newspaper, I have a column on the subject in the Asian Age Deccan Chronicle tomorrow, you would have to write something well enough to pass editorial muster. Your facts and opinions would have to be checked, vetted, and challenged. Your prose might be cut for space reasons or mere editorial whim. And you might have to wait days, if not weeks, to see your words in print. None of that applies to social media. You can write all you want, as you want, in the words you want, on a blog or a Facebook page, put it up with a Twitter link, click a mouse, and instantly watch it all go viral. It's a 21st century freedom that no democratic political leader would wish to confront. And yet this very freedom is its own biggest threat. It means anyone can say literally anything, and invariably many do. Lies, distortions, and calumny go into cyberspace unchallenged. Hatred, pornography, and slander are routinely aired. There is no fact-checking, no institutional reputation for reliability to defend. The anonymity permitted by social media encourages even more irresponsibility. People hidden behind pseudonyms feel free to hurl vile abuses that they would never dare to utter to the recipient's face. The borderline between legitimate creative expression and disparaging, inflammatory, or defamatory content becomes more difficult to draw. I spoke to Kapil Sibal when this controversy erupted, and he told me that his main concern was not with politics, but with scurrilous material about certain religions that could have incited retaliatory violence by their adherents. People say or depict things in social media that might be bad enough in their living rooms, but are positively dangerous in a public space. The challenge of regulating social media is that the person writing or drawing such things does so in the privacy of his home, but releases them onto the global commons. My own yardstick is very clear. I reject censorship. Art, literature, and political opinion are to me sacrosanct. But publishing or circulating inflammatory material to incite communal feelings is akin to dropping a lighted match at a petrol pump. No society can afford to tolerate it, and no responsible government of India would allow it. Now, that position has got me almost as much hate mail on the internet as poor Kapil Sibal. But I'd rather stub out the match than close down the petrol pump. And that is the kind of challenging decision that a democratic government has to make when it focuses on applying human rights in the cultural context and the political context of its own country. I suspect this is an issue you will have to grapple with in your work ahead. And I do want to go beyond that, especially with UNDP amongst the co-sponsors, and say that particularly in a world in which market capitalism is triumphant, it is important to stress that the right to development is also a universal human right. The very concept of development evolved in tune with the concept of human rights. Decolonization and self-determination advanced side by side with a consciousness of the need to improve the standards of living of subject peoples. The idea that human rights could be ensured merely by the state not interfering with individual freedom cannot survive confrontation with a billion hungry, deprived, illiterate, and jobless human beings around the globe. Human rights, in the memorable phrase, start with breakfast. For the sake of the deprived, the notion of human rights has to be a positive, active one. Not just protection from the state, but also the protection of the state, to permit these human beings to fulfill the basic aspirations of growth and development that are frustrated by poverty and scarce resources. We have to accept that social deprivation and economic exploitation are just as evil as political oppression or racial persecution. This calls for a more profound approach to both human rights and development. Without development, human rights could not be truly universal, since universality must be predicated upon the most underprivileged in developing countries achieving empowerment. We cannot exclude the poorest of the poor from the universality of the rich. After all, do some societies have the right to deny human beings the opportunity to fulfill their aspirations for growth and fulfillment legally and in freedom, while other societies organize themselves in such a way as to permit and encourage human beings freely to fulfill the same needs? On what basis can we accept a double standard that says an Australian's need to develop his own potential is a right, while an Angolan's or an Albanian's is a luxury? It's essential to recognize that universality does not presuppose uniformity, however. To assert the universality of human rights is not to suggest that our views of human rights transcend all possible philosophical, cultural, or religious differences, or that they represent a magical aggregation of the world's ethical and philosophical systems. It's not possible. Rather, it's enough that they do not fundamentally contradict the ideals and aspirations of any society, and that they reflect our common universal humanity from which no human being must be excluded. And that's why having a sub-regional workshop makes sense. You start off with the platform of universality, and then you apply it in your sub-regional context. Most basically, human rights derive from the mere fact of being human. They are not the gift of a particular government or legal code. But the standards being proclaimed internationally can become reality only when applied by countries within their own legal systems. The challenge is to work towards the indigenization of human rights and their assertion within each country's traditions and history. If different approaches are welcomed within the established framework, if, in other words, eclecticism can be encouraged as part of the consensus and not be seen as a threat to it, then this flexibility can guarantee universality, enrich the intellectual and philosophical debate, and so complement rather than undermine the concept of worldwide human rights. Paradoxical as it may seem, it is a universal idea of human rights that can in fact help make the world safe for diversity. Thank you for listening to me so patiently, and I wish you a very successful workshop in the days to come. Congratulations. Jai Hind.